Hello, shalom and marhaban. You're listening to Yalla, the podcast which works to combat lies, confront misconceptions, and hopefully, if I've done my job, challenge you to think deeper about things. I'm Amie, your friendly neighborhood biblical resource writer, and I'm so happy you've chosen to spend some time with me today. Well, welcome back, y'all. I hope everyone in the U.S. had a wonderful time celebrating our country's 250th birthday. Woohoo! We certainly did. I know I've wanted to see Young Washington, and we got a chance to do that. I don't know if y'all know what that is, but the movie, and it did not disappoint. So that was fun. But anyhow, here's a joke for you all to segue from Washington to Moses. Okay, are you ready for this? What did George Washington say when he met Moses? I crossed the Delaware. Moses replied, cute. I like that one, it's sophisticated in its simplicity. Now, before I start, I want to encourage you, if you haven't done so, to listen to episode 1 of the series, because we dive into certain things that are relevant for our discussion today, particularly about Pharaoh, the idea of Mot, and order in Egyptian society, and the relationship between the ancient Egyptian and the serpent. Very rich material. I'm biased because I'm obsessed with this stuff. I know it's kind of my bread and butter, but it truly will add significance, a lot of background for our purposes here in ancient Egypt. So, good stuff, but I will go into some of that during this episode, but for more of a rich and detailed take, give episode 1 a listen. Now, let's get into it, shall we? Now, what if I told you the first attack in Egypt began before the water turned red? What if the opening shot was actually fired in Pharaoh's throne room, before the Nile became blood, before frogs covered the land, before darkness swallowed Egypt? God sent a message through a serpent. Imagine the scene for a moment. Moses and Aaron are standing before Pharaoh, surrounded by his court. Egypt's officials, priests, and magicians are watching. In the very place where Pharaoh's authority is displayed, usually, Aaron throws down the staff, and it shifts forms. Now, probably a lot of us will find ourselves familiar with this scene from hearing versions of it so many times in the past. It's one of those that kind of weird, but you just keep reading on anyway, because that's what you're supposed to do, right? I guess the vast majority of people do this. I know many of us probably feel so familiar with these stories, and without context, they almost feel like additions to Alice in Wonderland. But let's pause and think about it here. In fact, as we go through this series, I want you to keep a thought front and center, and the thought is this: I bet the ancient world knew things that I don't, and that this is more significant than I think. Really, this could be applied to many places in the Bible, but for the sake of this series, it's a good one to hold on to, because specifically in this case, to an ancient Egyptian, the theological messaging would have been a bit ominous and terrifying. We're going to jump into Exodus chapter 4, but before we do, I want to provide a bit of background here. Now, before in chapter 3, the Lord is speaking to Moses, and he reveals his plan for his people, the Israelites. Now, here I'm going to shamelessly plug another series of mine on this topic. I did a 4-part series on Jacob called His Name Became Israel. Check it out when you have a chance. But these descendants of Abraham have had upwards of 400 years here to multiply, and they have multiplied a lot. In fact, Exodus 1 says, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew extremely strong, so that the land was filled with them." And in verse 12 and 13 says, "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves." So here we have Israel multiplying greatly, even while put under tremendous slavery. So God in chapter 3 systematically lays out how he is going to free his son, Israel. Even that wording has a theological type message for Pharaoh that he would have picked up on, but we'll get to that later. So we have the Lord of the Hebrews explaining to Moses how he plans to rescue them from Pharaoh by mighty acts, and how his allotment, his people, will not leave Egypt empty-handed, but with silver and gold given to them by their neighbors. In essence, God is going to take care of everything. Moses and Aaron only need to follow the Lord's instructions. So after this, in Genesis 4, verses 1 through 5, reading from the ESV, and I should say I read from the ESV previously, but it says, "Then Moses answered, 'But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord,'" capital Lord here, "The Lord did not appear to you." The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A staff." And he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and catch it by the tail." So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Okay, that's the end there. So God gives Moses the first sign. His staff becomes a serpent. Now, that word for serpent is nachash in Hebrew. That will become important in a moment. Then it turns back to a staff. Now let's jump over to Exodus 7, the showdown before Pharaoh. Again, reading from the ESV, we'll read verses 8 through 13 here. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Prove yourselves by working a miracle,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a tanin. I'm going to interject here. This word tanin is translated as a serpent in English. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Okay, pause. We got snakes and staffs and soothsayers and a former prince of Egypt telling Pharaoh about a God that demands they be released. So what's the deal with all the snakes? Let's look at this again. Aaron throws down his staff. It becomes a tanin. Now, Egyptian magicians, as the text unfortunately chooses to translate it as, actually they're khartoum, think soothsayers. I'll get into that in a moment. But they do the same thing by their secret arts, only Aaron's serpent swallows theirs. Now, you might have noticed something with the words here. Back in Exodus 4, when God gives Moses the sign of the burning bush, his staff becomes a nachash, the ordinary word, Hebrew word for snake or serpent. But when Moses and Aaron stand before Pharaoh in Exodus 7, the word changes. Aaron's staff doesn't become a nachash, it becomes a tanin. So why the different word? Now, this is one of those things that scholars have debated for a very long time. Something tanin refers to a crocodile or a much larger reptile, because Egypt was famous for the Nile and crocodiles, but it was also famous for the serpent. Others point out that throughout the Old Testament, tanin often describes something much bigger and more terrifying than an ordinary snake, a sea monster, a dragon, or symbol of the untamed forces of chaos. It's the same word used in Genesis 1 when God creates the great sea creatures. It's also used in Psalm 74 and Ezekiel 29 to describe Egypt and Pharaoh as a great dragon or a great serpent lying in the Nile. I don't want to take us too far into the weeds with this one, but in Professor John Currid's book, Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament, he uses many examples showing that most likely the word tanin is simply used interchangeably here with nachash. In Deuteronomy and in Psalms, tanin is also used interchangeably with peitan, a word meaning horned viper. There's more, but I'll stop there. Okay, let's get out of the weeds for a moment and talk. The point is, God isn't just performing a magic trick. He's confronting Egypt on its own turf. In Egypt thought, the serpent was one of the nation's most powerful symbols. The cobra appeared on Pharaoh's crown as a sign of divine authority and protection. Again, this is discussed in more detail in episode 1 of the series. Serpents filled Egyptian myths, temples, spells, and religious imagery. Pharaoh ruled under the protection of the gods, symbolized by the serpent. Then Aaron throws down one staff. It becomes a tanin. And when Egypt's soothsayers imitate the miracle, Aaron's serpent swallows theirs whole. This is a visual sermon. Before a single plague falls, God is already announcing the outcome. Egypt's power will be swallowed up. Pharaoh's gods will be swallowed up, rendered completely helpless and unable to stop the God of the Israelites from either creating or decreating. Yahweh will even use Pharaoh's priests to help him. These Egyptian lecture priests will fight against the Egyptian theological order called Mat, the thing that Pharaoh supposedly maintained, by producing some of the same acts of chaos that Yahweh enacts upon the land. Oops. We'll get to see more of that as we move along throughout the plagues. Those poor Khartoumim priests don't know what they're doing here, but chaos itself will be swallowed up. I want to get into the role of the so-called Egyptian magicians or Egypt lector priests. But before we get into some of those details, I want y'all to hear this because it's not something that many people have heard before, and it's quite interesting. I'm again going to quote John Currid here. This is one of the names you'll become familiar with throughout the series. Now listen to this. Reading from his book, Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament on page 85, he writes, quote, "The fact of the matter is that Exodus chapter 7, verses 8 through 13, he's talking about the snake throwdown, is critical for our understanding of what follows because it is a paradigm of the plague narratives. The serpent confrontation foreshadowed Yahweh's humiliation of Egypt through the plagues and at the Red Sea. The incident of the serpents and the crossing of the Red Sea are the boundaries of the entire narrative, reinforcing its singular theme. Supporting that contention is the word Bala, which appears in Exodus 7:12. Aaron's rod swallowed the magician's rods, and in Exodus 15:12, the Egyptian army was swallowed in the Red Sea. In addition, the staff that swallowed the sorcerer's snakes points to the staff that caused the waters to engulf the Egyptian army. Exodus 14, verses 16 and 26. Such parallels establish Exodus 7, verses 8 through 13, as a microcosmic prototype of the imminent national catastrophe of Egypt. Therefore, the plague narratives must be considered in light of the serpent confrontation." Okay, end quote. So let me break this down. Essentially, the serpent confrontation isn't just an interesting miracle. It actually sets the pattern for everything that's about to happen. In other words, if you understand the serpent confrontation, you'll better understand the plagues. All of this works together in tandem here. Before a single plague falls, God gives Pharaoh a preview of the entire story. Aaron's staff swallows the magician's serpents, showing that Yahweh's power will completely overcome Egypt's power. That same staff will later stretch over the Red Sea, where God will swallow up Pharaoh's army. The Hebrew word bala, to swallow, appears in both scenes, creating a kind of literary connection between the beginning and the end of the Exodus story. The serpent confrontation is like a miniature version of the whole Exodus narrative. It foreshadows what God is about to do on a national scale. Egypt's gods, Egypt's king, and ultimately Egypt itself will all be shown powerless before Yahweh. You see, the plagues aren't a random series of miracles. They're the unfolding of the victory God announced right at the beginning. And this is done before Pharaoh and his magicians. Now let's talk about these so-called magicians, shall we? One small detail gets lost in almost every English Bible. When we read that Pharaoh summoned his magicians, it's easy to picture illusionists, men doing tricks with sleight of hand for the entertainment of others. But that's not what an ancient Israelite or an ancient Egyptian would have imagined. Let's get into the word here. The Hebrew word here is khartoumim, and most Egyptologists agree it's borrowed directly from an Egyptian title meaning chief lector priest. These weren't entertainers. They were some of the most educated and influential religious officials in all of Egypt. A chief lector priest was responsible for reciting sacred texts, performing temple rituals, preserving religious knowledge, interpreting omens, and invoking the power of the gods through ritual and spoken formulas. Think of them as scholars, priests, and ritual specialists all wrapped into one. Egyptian literature even portrays them as men who possess secret knowledge, even unknown to the king. They could predict future events and performed extraordinary deeds through the power of the gods they served. Suddenly, this isn't Moses facing a few court magicians trying to copy his tricks. This is Yahweh confronting the very men who represented Egypt's religious wisdom and spiritual power. That's why as we move along here, we'll find that their repeated failures become so significant. At first, they imitate some of the signs, but they never undo God's work. In fact, what they actually do is make matters worse for Egypt. If the Nile becomes blood, they don't restore the river. They simply produce more quote-unquote blood. Their power, whatever its source, can't reverse Yahweh's judgment. Eventually, they reach a breaking point and tell Pharaoh, this is truly the finger of God. Coming from Egypt's highest religious authorities, that's an astonishing confession. The very men expected to uphold Egypt's spiritual order admit they have reached the limits of their power. Throughout the series, we'll see that Yahweh isn't simply defeating individual gods, he's dismantling an entire worldview. Pharaoh, the priests, the temples, the rituals, the Nile itself. Every pillar that Egypt believed sustained its universe is shown to be powerless before the God of Israel. Now, every time your English Bible says magicians, I want you to mentally replace that word with Egypt's chief priests and ritual experts, or at least, in the book of Exodus, but that's much closer to what the text is describing here, and it raises the stakes of the story considerably. Now let's get into some of the interesting bits from the snake scene. What's the deal with throwing down a staff? Have you ever actually stopped and thought about that? It seems a little dramatic, doesn't it? The original mic drop. Let's start with the staff itself. Throughout Egypt's history, one of the primary symbols of kingship and authority was actually the shepherd's crook. Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer points this out in his book titled Israel in Egypt, The Evidence for the Authenticity of the Exodus Tradition. It's an incredible book, by the way, but it's a heavy hitter on things most people have never heard about in regards to the Exodus. Really, really, really well written. But anyhow, so in this book on page 317, Hoffmeyer states, quote, throughout pharaonic history, one of the regular symbols of kingship was a small shepherd's crook. These are ubiquitous in royal statuary and iconography. I'm cutting in here in common terms. He's saying if you looked at ancient Egypt, statues, carvings, or paintings of Pharaoh, you'd notice one thing over and over again. He's holding a shepherd's staff. So Hoffmeyer continues, William Hayes argued that the adoption of the shepherd's crook as a divine and royal scepter and as a general symbol of authority goes back far into Egypt's prehistory, end quote. Now, a little further down, Hoffmeyer states, quote, the shape of the hieroglyph and tomb illustrations of the crook has been confirmed by actual discoveries of the staff from the Middle Kingdom. In the wisdom of Meragare, circa 2200 BC, humanity is described in the following manner. Well-nourished is mankind, God's flock. If humans were considered God's flock, then the association of the king as shepherd and humans as the flock can easily be made. That's the end of the quote. Now, there's a lot that we could dive in here from an ancient Middle Eastern biblical perspective, but I want to hone in on our topic right now. We have kings, high-ranking officials, and even the gods frequently depicted carrying the shepherd's staff as a sign of their authority. It began as a tool of an actual shepherd, but over centuries it became the emblem of one who ruled over people. As Hoffmeyer shows us, even Egyptian wisdom literature speaks of humanity as the flock of the gods, making the imagery unmistakable. The king was the shepherd, and the people his flock. So what does this mean for us? Well, when Aaron stands before Pharaoh holding a shepherd's staff, he's not simply carrying a walking stick, but a symbol of authority. And with this symbol of authority, something astonishing happens. Aaron throws it to the ground. Now, to us, that's simply the setup for a miracle. Most of us know instinctively what will happen next. But in Egypt, throwing down a staff had another layer of meaning. Egyptian literature is filled with stories of priests and magicians performing extraordinary feats with staffs. One of the most famous examples comes from the West Kar Papyrus, which tells the story of a lector priest named Uba-Oner. He creates a crocodile out of wax, throws it into the water, and it becomes a living crocodile. Later, he picks it up again, and it returns to wax. Stories like this celebrated the supposed wisdom and supernatural abilities of Egypt's priesthood. Now, I want you to hear again from John Currid in his book on page 92. He has a section titled The Irony of the Serpent Confrontation, which I think is a fantastic title. Currid explains this really well. Listen to this. Quote, in the first place, the textual evidence from the early periods tells us of the Egyptians' pride in their power to manipulate venomous creatures. Moses and Aaron duplicate this feat. However, this was by no means the only proof which Moses gives that he was versed in the magic of the Egyptians. For like the sage Abba-Aner and King Nectanebus and all other magicians of Egypt, from time immemorial, he and Aaron possessed a wonderful rod by means of which they worked wonders. The irony is that the two Hebrew leaders chose to humiliate and defeat the Egyptians in areas that traditionally rendered glory to the Egyptians. As Ernst Hengstenberg remarks, Moses was furnished with power to perform that which the Egyptian magicians most especially gloried in, and by which they most of all supported their authority. Second, throwing down the staff was a challenge to the power of the Egyptian magic, as described in numerous mythological texts. Egyptian documents are replete with examples of magicians performing extraordinary feats, including changing inanimate objects into animals. End quote. Okay, that was a lot. Let's pause here. Aaron didn't just throw down the staff because it was a random act that Yahweh asked him to do. As is the case with, I would say, most of what the Lord asks his people, there's a deeper theological purpose. I want us to sit with that for a moment. God knows the stories in the Egyptian papyrus and what the Egyptians believe. Being omnipresent and omniscient, he saw when they wrote on the papyrus the incantations and stories of their gods, most of which are super wild and some are just plain disgusting, just as a side note, but he isn't surprised by any of it. He knows they pride themselves in their stories of turning objects into living creatures, their desire to have the abilities of the gods to make and replicate life. He knows that the staff is a symbol of power to them, that they long to be like God. So when he is telling Moses and Aaron to perform these things, the message could hardly be clearer. Yahweh isn't competing with Egypt's power. If that were the case, there would be no contest. He's demonstrating his supremacy over it. The Lord plays the long game. It's as if he's saying, you want the Egyptians to believe you are working with the gods and have the power of the gods, but I'm going to reveal to you all who the true God is. He's showing the Egyptians and even other ethnicities, the Asiatics, maybe some of the Hyksos, and even his own prized possession, the Hebrews, who he is and what he knows. Not only that, but he shows them who he is using their own theological model. He didn't have to do that, but he used a language they understood to reveal to them what they didn't know. The Lord knows us intimately and is all-powerful. We simply forget. Just as a side note, it wasn't just the Hebrews who left Egypt after the plagues. We tend to forget this, or we just plain don't know it. In Exodus 12, verses 38, it states that a mixed multitude went up with them. Others saw what the God of the Hebrews did. Others saw the theological signs and understood them. Many Egyptians left with them. I'll say this again because it's worth repeating. The Lord isn't competing with Egypt's power. He's demonstrating his supremacy over it. Now, we discussed the context of the staff, but what about the action itself? Did the Egyptian priests really change their staffs into serpents by way of sorcery? Did they have supernatural power? To dive into this, I'm going to reference several people because it's important that y'all don't just hear my opinions on this. So Currid had this to say about the issue on page 94. How the chief lector priests of Egypt were able to transform their staffs into serpents was a matter for conjecture, even in the earliest commentaries. Almost all the early scholars agreed that the Egyptian magicians accomplished their feat by a mere sleight of hand. The changing of staffs into snakes was simply an illusion. Ibn Ezra commented that the magicians were adept in altering the external appearance of things by their arts. Others maintained that the Egyptians were truly able to change rods into serpents because they possessed some sort of evil supernatural power. In the 19th century, a new approach was taken. Scholars like Ernst Hengstenberg, Alfred Naveen, and Alan McNeill called attention to the Psylli, that is P-S-Y-L-L-I, contemporary Egyptian snake charmers. End quote. Okay, now listen to this. This is interesting and a little gross, actually. But in Ernst Wilhelm Hengstenberg's book, Egypt and the Book of Moses, a book that was published in 1845, he goes into some detail about the Psylli. The Psylli, in simplest terms, were an ancient Libyan nomadic tribe known for their snake charming skills. So in response to Exodus 7, the lector priests throwing down their rods and whether or not they became actual snakes, on page 100, Hengstenberg writes this. In the religious festivals, the Psylli appeared entirely naked, with the neck, arms, and other parts of the body coiled around by serpents, which they permit to sting and tear their breast and stomach, and effectually defend themselves against them with a sort of frenzy, pretending to wish to eat them alive. I'm going to cut in here. I wanted to paint y'all a picture as to who the Psylli were. These soothsayers or these workers with snakes. This isn't what I would call your everyday clean profession. Sometimes it helps just to have a vivid picture of what some of these things looked like. So Hengstenberg continues, their sleight of hand is very various. They are able to, according to their assertions, to change the hajj, that is, the species of serpent which they especially make use of for their tricks, into a rod and compel them to feign themselves dead. When they wish to perform this operation, they spit into the throat of the animal, compel it to shut its mouth, and lay it down upon the ground. Then, as if in order to give a last command, they lay their hand upon its head, and immediately the serpent, stiff and motionless, falls into a kind of torpor. They wake it up when they wish, seizing it by the tail and rolling it roughly between the hands. Dubois-Aime gives his testimony to the same thing." End quote. And just for notes, Dubois-Aime was a French Egyptologist in the 19th century, so he's stating here that Dubois agrees and says the same thing. Now listen to this next part. Quote, "That which is related to us of the condition of modern serpent charmers and the practice of their sleight of hand is entirely sufficient to give an insight into the condition of the Egyptian magicians who withstood Moses." End quote. So let me explain this in simple language. Hengstenberg is saying this. Egypt had a long-standing reputation for priests who could perform extraordinary feats involving serpents. Whether through remarkable skill, ritual practice, or deception, these demonstrations were central to the prestige and authority of Egypt's religious leaders. The cobra itself was sacred, symbolizing divine power and even appearing on Pharaoh's crown as a sign of his royal authority. Ancient writers describe Egyptian priests as experts at handling and charming snakes, and archaeology has uncovered mummified cobras, confirming their religious importance. In other words, the serpent wasn't just an animal. It was one of the most recognizable symbols of Egypt's religion and kinship. So when God chose a serpent as his opening sign, he wasn't choosing a random miracle. He was confronting Egypt in the very arena where its priests, its religion, and its king believed they were strongest. Hengstenberg states further down in the article that it's important to understand, even with their sleight of hand and their extreme displays that they would perform, they sincerely felt this was power from the gods. You can still use sleight of hand and do extreme things like foaming at the mouth, which they would do, and sincerely believe you have supernatural powers. We even see this today, don't we, if we're honest? I mean, there's less foaming of the mouth, of course, but people who fall under a delusion that they possess secret knowledge or that the hand of God has elected them above others. That's where we run into the problem of people believing they are the Messiah or possess special knowledge and form cults. But anyhow, Hengstenberg believes that the priests may have developed delusions of grandeur, believing they had been uniquely empowered by the gods. Now, another article on this topic is from a commentary on Exodus titled Exodus, the Expositor's Bible Commentary, Revised Edition. It holds more authority if you read the title with an accent and just, it's a little more dramatic. It just can't be a southern accent. That would sound like Exodus, the Expositor's Bible Commentary, Revised Edition. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't sound the same. I don't know. Maybe both work, but anyhow. This one is by Walter C. Kaiser Jr., Tremper Longman III, I love him so much, and David Garland. So in this section titled Presenting the Signs of Divine Authority, chapter 7, verses 6 through 13, on page 163, it says, "The relationship between Aaron's miracle and the magical act of the magicians, whom Paul calls Jannes and Jambres in 2 Timothy 3:8, is hard to define. Possibly by illusion and deceptive appearances they are able to cast spells over what appear to be their staffs, but which are actually serpents rendered immobile, catalepsy, by pressure on the nape of their necks and by the use of magical spells. Or perhaps it is done via demonic power." I like this part. Listen to this, though. "However, as evidence of God's greater power, Pharaoh's magicians lose their staffs when Aaron's staff swallows up theirs." And that's the end of the quote. All right, so we've read a bunch of commentaries and a bunch of views on various experts. But here's my 2 cents. After reading Currid, Hoffmeyer, Longman, Garland, Kaiser, and even Hengstenberg, I find myself persuaded by a very simple explanation. We just discovered together that ancient Egyptian literature is filled with stories of priests performing astonishing feats in ancient sources describing Egyptian experts who are famous for handling serpents in amazing crowds. There are several other ancient examples that I did not share, and you're welcome for that. Whether through remarkable skill, ritual performance, or sleight of hand, these demonstrations reinforced the priest's authority and convinced people they possessed divine power. The biblical text never tells us exactly how Pharaoh's priests produced their serpents, and I think that's intentional. The emphasis isn't on explaining their method, it's on exposing their limitations. Now, personally, I lean toward the view that these priests employed techniques similar to those celebrated in Egyptian tradition. My reasoning here is theological. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, the power to create life belongs to Yahweh alone. From the opening word of Genesis, where God speaks creation into existence, to Isaiah 44, verse 24, where he declares, I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens. Scripture consistently seems to present creation as God's unique prerogative. John chapter 1 and Psalm 33 echoes the same truth. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. Again and again, the Bible emphasizes that the Creator stands alone. Now, what's equally interesting to me is what we don't find. Even as Jewish thought during the Second Temple period, with books like First Enoch and Jubilees describing rebellious spiritual beings, demons, and fallen angels in much greater detail, they are never portrayed as creatures of life. They deceive, corrupt, tempt, spread forbidden knowledge, and oppose God's purposes, but they don't possess the Creator's power to bring life into existence. That distinction remains remarkably consistent. The main takeaway on this topic is that the author isn't asking us to marvel at Pharaoh's priests. He wants us to watch what happens next. Whatever they did, whatever methods they employed, whatever power they claimed to possess, Aaron's serpent swallowed theirs. Before a single plague falls on Egypt, God has already revealed how this story ends. The contest was never between equals. It was a declaration that every rival claim to authority, whether Pharaoh, his priests, or the gods they served, would ultimately be swallowed up by the sovereign power of Yahweh. Before we close out this episode, I want to talk about one more thing that I find to be quite interesting about the difference between how God chooses and how we choose. One of the differences between Moses and the Egyptian Khaltumim, or priests. In Egyptian thought, words were not empty sounds. A properly spoken word could do something. The right name, the right formula, the right ritual could participate in Heka, the power by which things were accomplished and by which the order of the world was maintained via Egyptian theological views. The Egyptian priests knew how to wield words. They were supposed to. But then there's Moses. The man who stands before Pharaoh is the same man who said to God in the Hebrew that he is heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. This is an idiomatic expression, either saying that he is no longer well versed in the language of the Egyptians, or has an actual speech impediment, or is employing exaggerated humility, which was common in the ancient Near East to indicate the need for help. The point is clear. He doesn't feel confident in his speech. He's not a skilled or persuasive speaker. Now, how does God respond? He doesn't answer Moses saying, become more impressive, learn the right formulas, and master the language of Egypt, or this is never going to work. God first says, who made man's mouth? Who made the deaf, the mute, and the blind? And he also says, I will be with you, Moses. This distinction matters. The Egyptian ritual experts believe power came through knowing the words that could move the unseen world. Moses stands before them not because he has discovered a stronger technique, but because he speaks on behalf of the one who created the world. The men who spent their lives mastering sacred speech are confronted by a man who says he cannot speak well, yet whose words carry the authority of the God who made the mouth itself, the God who is also the Logos, the Word. Egypt had masters of words. Israel had the Word who sent Moses. The contest has begun. Before a single plague has fallen, Yahweh has already challenged Pharaoh's authority, humbled Egypt's most celebrated priests, and shown that their power cannot stand before him. But all of that was only the introduction. Now, in the description of this episode, I'll leave the names of the sources that I used if any of y'all want to dig a little deeper. There are some fascinating works out there. If we take the time to pause and listen. That's the theme of this podcast, right? Stop, pause, listen, and think critically. So please join me next time as we watch God strike not Egypt's army, not its temples, but the very thing that made Egypt possible, the Nile River, Egypt's lifeblood, its economy, its calendar, its religion, and in many ways the foundation of its entire worldview. What happens when the source of life suddenly becomes a source of death? That's where we'll pick up next. I was hoping to maybe get to it this round, but there was just so much depth and breadth that I wanted to cover with the staff narrative that, I just didn't want to try to pigeonhole the Nile into this episode. But anyhow, as always, thank you so much for traversing these ancient lands with me, and I sincerely mean that. There's so much that y'all could be doing, and you choose to spend part of your morning or afternoon or evening with me, and I am very grateful. And I hope you all have found some of this cool and that it has deepened your understanding of the Hebrew scriptures. It's always fun to have those aha moments. And as always, know that you have value. We're created for a unique purpose and that you are deeply loved by God. Ma salem, veli yitraot. We'll chat soon.